The one who comes before. The beginning of my story is a typical one. Two young people in love, high school sweethearts, conceived a child out of wedlock. They married hastily at the urgings of their parents so that my mother wouldn't bring her family into disrepute. It stretches credulity that people once behaved that way, that something as simple as an unplanned child could cause such social uproar. But it happened. So my mother was rushed to the hospital in the throes of labor, 7 months after marrying my father. Nothing went smoothly with my birth. My father often joked that I'd been a difficult child right from the beginning, but my mother's mouth pinched into a downward moo whenever he mentioned that night. I discovered much later that my heavily sedated mother gave birth via cesarean section, and when they handed the dazed woman her child, its newborn squalling, displaying a mouthful of tiny teeth, she pushed me away. She claimed that I wasn't her baby, and insisted that I belonged to some other woman. I found out the detail of that story when I was 7, going through my father's journals in the garage. It didn't make me feel very good about myself. As I grew, so did that schism between my mother and me. It was as if she had never quite shaken that feeling that I wasn't her child, and it wasn't helped at all by my behavior. Both of my parents had been quiet and well-behaved as children, and neither of them could fathom how this fractious, disobedient, and willful creature had been conceived from their own flesh. To add to that, my baby hair never darkened into the oily brown that both my parents possessed, and so I grew up white blonde and surrounded by rumors that my father wasn't actually my father. I'm not sure which of us that hurt the most, because he doted on me, as most fathers do upon their daughters, and I felt like he was the only parent who loved me. School was difficult. A natural daydreamer, I simply couldn't focus in the classroom. When the lunch bell rang, I was the first out of the door, and when it rang again to indicate that lunch was over, I was often far away from the school, poking around in a dumpster or hiding in a secluded nook of the public library with a book full of fairy tales. I wasn't a bad kid, I just lost track of things. I'd be so intent on what I was doing that time would spiral away, out of control, until I was suddenly being yelled at by my mother while she spanked my already bruised backside with a wooden spoon. Eventually, my father bought me a fancy electronic watch for my 10th birthday. The little artificial chirrups would remind me every hour to check the time. But that only solved one problem. The name of the first boy was Danny Carmichael. He'd put mud down the back of my neck in class and slap me between the shoulders to make it splatter all over my white school shirt. A therapist told me that I didn't remember what happened because of the trauma, but I didn't feel traumatized when they explained what I had done. I felt happy that Danny got his dues for being such a little shit to me. Apparently, after I realized what he'd done, I stood up and kicked my chair backwards, right into his shins. While he howled in pain and clutched his legs, I calmly took off my muddy shirt, threw it over his head, and then wrestled him to the floor and pulled it tight around his neck. By the time the teacher intervened, Danny was a blubbering, muddy wreck, gasping for air and scrambling to get as far away from me as possible. After 2 more incidents with other children, they put me on medication for my behavioral issues. But the therapist didn't address the real issue, because I didn't talk about it. My mother didn't think I was her baby, and my father was afraid that I wasn't his. It's no wonder that a wristwatch and a bunch of pills couldn't fix me. The meds took the edge off, but they couldn't fully quench the simmering chaos inside me. They switched me to another school after I managed to beat the ever-living shit out of a bully in the year above me, pills or no pills. I was told that I was on my last chance. The next stop would be a corrective boarding school. Knowing that my mother would jump at the chance to send me away, I fought with myself and with my own natural impulses, trying desperately not to let the roiling emotions inside me boil to the surface again. And so I became the recluse, the weirdo in the corner of the library, reading books about distant worlds where girls like me were the heroes, not the misfits. Labyrinth became a staple whenever my parents weren't home. I played it so many times that the tape became stretched and the sound oddly warped, in that way that old VCR movies did. The music warbled and wavered uncertainly, and the colored images fuzzed and flickered about the edges. But children are cruel, and a target like me was irresistible. The girl, Tamsin Rogers, had decided to instigate a sort of official girl group ostracism of me, which initially backfired because I couldn't have given 2 shits about their approval. And when they teased me in the PE changing rooms for still wearing a butterfly-spotted training bra at 16, That thing that lurked inside me crept malevolently over the edge of that brimming well of treacherous chaos. Nobody really told me what happened, but the third-degree burns on Tamsin's face and shoulders gave me a few clues. There was always that one shower in the changing rooms that ran far too hot. I think I probably held her face into the boiling torrent while she screamed and screamed in agony. And so it was off to boarding school for me, along with a strictly monitored dose of heavier medications to damp the flash fires of rage that kept surfacing. I didn't do well in that environment either. The drugs made me calmer, more disconnected from myself, but they also made it impossible not to daydream. Could no longer focus in class for even a minute, no matter how much the teacher threatened me. I'd stare at the blotchy birthmark on the inside of my wrist and imagined it was a butterfly. The mark of a fairy princess who had been swapped at birth with some mortal child, a test of her worthiness to be the queen of the fair folk. When I dropped out, nobody was surprised. Even with all the remedial classes in the world, I was a dopey loser on drugs, incapable of remembering even the most basic of scholastic information. At 18, an adult in the eyes of the law, I refused to take the medication anymore, adamantly telling my mother that she couldn't make me. She replied coldly and triumphantly that if I was an adult, then I could move out and never darken her doorstep with my presence again. It took me all of an hour to pack the few things I wanted to take with me. Some books, some clothes, my old wristwatch, and the battered copy of Labyrinth. I remember my father and I staring at each other for a long moment as I hefted my backpack onto one shoulder. But I could tell he wasn't really even looking at me. He was staring at my white blonde hair and still wondering if I was really his daughter, or was I to get of some other man my mother had fucked behind his back. And so I left. Off the pills, I was finally able to concentrate again, to retain memories and learn new things. The government kindly put me on the dole while I looked for work, and I found a tiny bedsit that I could just afford with that money. There wasn't much to do during the day as an emancipated teen on a government benefit, so whenever the weather was good, I'd head to the park to read. I'd loved that park as a kid. It was one of those sprawling domains that started in one part of the city and eventually emerged via interconnected walkways, little urban forests, and huge open fields into a completely different part of town. You could start at the grassy tip of Masters Avenue Hill and end up somewhere near the racecourse, not touching any asphalt streets at all. It was during one of those jaunts that I first met Nick. We didn't have many truly homeless people back then. The economy was mighty and unemployment was at a record low. Instead, we had people to whom the government gave money and housing, but they still drifted on the edges of society. Untreated or poorly treated mental health issues leaving them unable to partake as full and productive citizens. Nick was one of these, an older man with a downy white beard and sparse white hair, always holding something in a brown paper bag and sucking on a cigarette. We'd see each other in the park often enough, and he'd lift a hand in greeting before going back to killing off brain cells with the rot gut he was drinking. Sometimes he would park beside me while I read my book, staring off into middle distance. There was something familiar and comfortable about his presence, as though I'd known him for a very long time. In my most private of fantasies, I even imagined that he was my true father, some kind of fairy king in disguise, checking up on his daughter in the mortal world, seeing if she was ready to come home. If only I'd known how far from the truth that was. It was a conversation with the owner of the local green grocer that clued me into Nick's origins. I can't remember how it came up, but I do remember the little florid-cheeked Greek man telling me that Nick had spent time up the hill in the Janet Morgan Institute. While he was there, they had given him electroshock therapy to drive the demons out of his addled brain. Claimed he was going to bring back the fairies, said the grocer while he bagged my apples. That he was going to open up a gateway to heaven and fill the world with butterflies or some such nonsense. Sounds like Nick, I replied, smiling as I paid the man. You're not related, are you? A mixture of fear and elation thrilled through me. No, why do you ask? Just that he's the only one in town with hair like yours, apparently white as snow since the day he was born. The conversation ended abruptly as I grabbed my bag and left. This new information churning inside my mind. Was Nick really my father? He seemed old enough, probably slightly older than my mother. But why would she have bedded a mad alcoholic weirdo like Nick? One way or another, I was going to get the truth out of him. I found him perched on the top of a children's slide in the park, basking in the sun's heat reflecting from the polished metal as he ashed casually over the edge. "Who are you?" I asked without any preamble. His bloodshot eyes regarded me. He was drunk already, at 10 o'clock in the morning. "It's old Nick, your old friend," he slurred. Annoyed, I clambered up the ladder and shoved him. He lost his balance and slid gracefully down the slide, landing in a heap at the bottom. Dropping to the ground, I stalked over and crouched beside the white-haired drunk. "Who are you?" He lay on his back and stared up at me. "Prince Nicky, future king of the fairies." He tapped the inside of his wrist where a blotchy birthmark stood out starkly on his pale flesh. I'd never noticed it before. "It's the mark of the fair folk," he continued. "Pretty butterfly." Electricity raked from my tailbone to the top of my head. "Are you my father?" His laugh was harsh, mocking, and holding some kernel of truth within it, one that I had yet to divine. No, our kind can't have children. I'm just the one who came before." "What do you mean?" "I was the one. I was gonna make it all happen." "Make what happen?" But from there I couldn't get anything but the usual drunk's nonsense out of him. Detoxing an alcoholic is a thankless job, but I persisted. Taking the booze off him didn't help. He'd just buy more and cheaper alcohol. When I paid off the liquor store owner to bar him from buying, Nick came looking for me. He was angry, his thin hands balled up and his step aggressive. He yelled at me to leave him alone, that he didn't need me meddling in his life. But when he swung his fist at me, I ducked it easily and pushed him onto his ass. He got more cunning then, asking strangers to buy him booze. I put up signs around the shopping center, telling people not to sell to the man. He tore them down, but not before everyone saw them. When he came for me the second time, I knocked him on his backside again. He wept in the dusty dirt near the slide and asked me why I was doing this to him. "Because I need you," I told him. Convincing him to come home with me wasn't very hard. I don't think Nick had eaten a decent meal in 20 years, and without even booze in his belly, the allure of food was too much for him. After he'd eaten, I put him in the bedsit's wonky bath and scrubbed him until he was clean, then shaved off the tangled mess of white beard. Sat in my poky little kitchen with a blanket around him, a cup of instant coffee in his hands and his face bare. He looked young, far younger than I thought. "Tell me about our people," I said. His eyes clear and his hands trembling from the withdrawal, he nursed the coffee and began his story. When he finished, I offered him a cigarette and another coffee. It had been rambling and fragmented, and I'm not sure how much of it was his own and how much was what he'd been told in the Janet Morgan Institute. He said he was a schizophrenic, that he had imagined as a child he was some sort of changeling put here by the fairies to guide them back into this world. At the Institute, he'd met another like himself who had come before him. "There was always one who comes before," he told me. Another white-haired misfit to guide the other along the path. But it was clear he no longer knew what he believed, or whether any of this was actually true. "I was supposed to bring him back," he raved. "I was supposed to throw open the doorway and reignite the world." I slept on the couch that night, while Nick occupied my bed. I dreamed of terrible and beautiful beings with white hair and pointed teeth, riding through a glimmering portal into our world. When I awoke, I felt a profound sense of loss, just as keen as the night I'd left my childhood home to live on my own. In the morning, I made fresh coffee and breakfast, then asked Nick how it was all supposed to have happened, how he was going to bring the fair folk back into the world. And so, in halting on certain stops and starts, Nick told me what he could remember. The park seemed the most apt of places, amongst the copse of trees in the middle of the sprawling fields. I remember walking through here as a child, with my father, back when he still thought my hair would eventually darken to brown like his. Drawing the charcoal circles with oak, ash, and thorn proved quite difficult, but I persisted. They didn't need to be large, just relatively unbroken. The rest of the ritual was simple enough. I just had to wait for the appointed time, and for the sacrifice to arrive. As the swollen moon crept high in the evening sky, I saw them walking down the little paved path into the copse. I swore. I had asked her to come alone, but my father was with her. This was a problem. My parents either didn't notice the charcoal circles scribed on the earth, or they didn't recognize their importance. My mother's mouth was as tight and unfriendly as always. Clearly the old schism was as wide as ever. Whatever you have to say, just say it so we can go back home. I truly hated her in that moment. I hated her so intensely. She'd never given me a chance. She'd never wanted me to be her daughter. Things would have been so very different if she'd just loved me. What I have to say to you needs to be said alone, I told her. No, whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of Michael. So, he was just Michael now, not even your father. That final betrayal was just too much for me. Lunging forward, I shouldered my father out of the way. My mother was a small, weak woman, and it wasn't difficult to spin her around and throw her into the circles, where she landed on her back with the wind knocked out of her. Finding a silver dagger had been a big ask, but I'd improvised by sharpening the hell out of a silver cutlery knife brought from the local pawn shop. You should have just loved me, I hissed as I knelt on her chest and plunged the knife into her jugular. And my father was in the circle trying to wrestle the knife out of my hand. He was going to ruin everything. If my mother didn't bleed out and die, I would never be reunited with my true family. A white blur appeared to my left, and then Nick and my father rolled out of the circles, tussling in the dirt. Nick had saved me. My only real kin on this earth had come to my aid. My mother clutched at the knife quivering in her throat, her mouth filling fast with blood so dark it was almost black. It spilled over my hands, painting the pale flesh with crimson. I rose those soiled, dripping digits in the yellow moonlight and painted a doorway in the air. For a moment, nothing happened. All I could hear was the grunting and snarling of the two men fighting each other behind me. Then, with a sound like a great doorway being opened into the cacophony of a vast banquet hall, a crack appeared in the world, and I saw them. They were taller than gods, magnificent in silver, gold, and precious gemstones. Their alien mouths were split in beatific smiles of pure malevolence, their cat-like canines whiter than ivory. They strode through a world of pure chaos, a howling, screaming, moaning moil of shapes and colors that fought, devoured, and shat out more of itself in an explosive cycle of kaleidoscopic insanity. Things flew around them, winged creatures with bald heads, noseless faces, and prehensile toes, their shrieking glee at the opening of the doorway apparent as their unearthly masters came closer to the gateway. With a cry of purest joy, Nick tossed my father to the side like a rag doll and then ran for the gateway. He stumbled through into the boiling morass of impossible shapes, trying to find footing. The 7 fairy nobles held out their arms to him, calling to him to come to them. Nick staggered in a blister of magenta mouths that ate themselves and vomited teeth. He battled through a blast of blue webs that burned his skin as they passed right through him. Then he was cradled in the slender arms of the leader of the godlings, a woman so beautiful that my eyes burned just looking at her. "Failure," she hissed, then tore Nick in half, the chaos around him eagerly gorging on his split, ruined flesh. In that instant I knew that there was a reason why the fair folk had been locked out of our world, a reason why they had striven so hard to break through again. With several slow, deliberate kicks I broke the charcoal circles and then I ran. As abruptly as it opened, the doorway slammed shut, sucking everything in around it. I spent 17 years in prison after the disappearance of my parents. Their bodies were never found because they couldn't be found. Not a trace of them was left from the night of the ritual. But it wasn't much of a stretch to pin it on the crazy, troubled daughter. I thought I would heal while I was incarcerated. That the time would soothe away the trauma and make me forget. But I can't. Not with such a constant reminder. You see, wherever I look now, I can see the silver cracks. Sometimes they shimmer in the sky, sometimes they crawl along the concrete. Occasionally, one will stretch for an instant, then something will come through with a flash of fangs, bald flesh, and prehensile toes. 18 years on from the ritual, there are so many cracks now that I know they will eventually connect, and they will sunder this world and unleash that unbridled insanity onto us. And so I sit in the park, on the sun-warmed slide, ashing a cigarette over the side. I drink my cheap vodka from a paper bag, and I listen to the hours chirp by from the plastic watch on my frail wrist. There's nothing else I can do.